Welcome everyone to our webinar. Please welcome Margaret Molloy.
Hello and good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to the Marketing Society webinar. Today we are going to talk about how COVID-19 is impacting the climate. The Marketing Society is a global organization of marketeers comprised of 3,000 members worldwide. We have 7 hubs and our focus is very much around bravery. How do we as marketeers exhibit bravery in all our work? I'm your host for this morning's conversation. I'm Margaret Molloy, the chair of the Marketing Society Hub in New York City, and I'm also the Global Chief Marketing Officer of Siegel+Gale. And I was truly honored when I was invited to engage this discussion. With half the world's population under lockdown, consumer habits changing dramatically, the impact on the environment for the reduced productivity and industry has been significant. Yet there is significant desire to sustain that conversation and see what can be done and what will the ultimate impact on climate change be of the COVID-19 pandemic. To help us unpack that conversation, we have 3 illustrious guests, and I will introduce them to you in a moment. Just some housekeeping to begin. We invite you to submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to those either in this session or in our follow-up communications. Let me begin, please, by introducing our panelists. First, I'd like to welcome Lauren Kiel. Lauren is the General Manager of Bloomberg Green, and Lauren is joining us from New York City, along with myself this morning. Next, Vikram Krishna is the Executive Vice President, Head of Consumer Marketing, Head of Customer Experience at Emirates NBD, joining us from Dubai. Our third and final panelist is Filip Engel. Filip is the Vice President for Public Affairs, Branding, Sustainability and Marketing at Ørsted in Denmark. A very good morning, good afternoon, you're all very welcome. And to warm up the room, we'd like to know where everyone is joining us from. So do please go into that chat function and let us know, guests, what city you're joining from this morning. I say this morning because I'm in New York, of course. Okay, so before Lauren sets the stage with wonderful data, let's, Siobhan, launch the poll, please, to get a sense for how people are thinking about climate change in terms of business priorities. So guests, please answer. I'll do the same. And we'll take the temperature, as it were. Okay, shall we see the results from the Marketing Society? Very interesting. So certainly almost 3/4 of our guests on this call see climate change as a priority in terms of your business agenda. So that makes sense, you're in the right conversation. So Lauren, shall you get us started? Lauren Kiel, again, the General Manager of Bloomberg Green. Tell us a little about Bloomberg Green in your own words and share some interesting data and perspectives that you've brought to the conversation.
Good morning, Margaret. Thank you so much for having me. We launched Bloomberg Green in January. Bloomberg Green is Bloomberg Media's new multi-platform editorial brand that's focused on climate specifically. We looked around at the media landscape and felt like there was a big gap for us to be able to share insights and solutions that were focused on climate. So to begin our conversation today, I want to share with you a little bit about what we've learned developing Bloomberg Green over the last few months, and just some insights for you all as marketers as you think about how you want to be talking about climate and sustainability during this time. So I'm going to share my presentation with you. Great. So as I mentioned, we launched Bloomberg Green in January. I know for me, and I'm sure for many of you, January feels like years ago at this point. feels like just such a different world. So much has changed so quickly. Every day is bringing something new for all of us. But I want to encourage you as marketers to think and not discount climate, not discount sustainability at this time, that this is actually a really, really important time for us to be thinking about what it means to make progress in climate. What are we learning from this moment where we're seeing this radical disruption of the status quo? We have this unprecedented opportunity to stop and think about when the ways that we change our lifestyles and the ways that we work and the ways that we travel and the ways that we exist in this world change so dramatically, what's the impact on the climate? What decisions can we make as we think about, for our businesses or for our lives, improving this in the future? So this is actually a very good time for all of us to be thinking about both what we can be doing in the current moment and what we can be doing to grow in the future. So I'll give you a little bit of background about how we got to Bloomberg Green and we came up with this idea. And then I'm going to share some insights and suggestions for you as marketers as you think about how you want to be talking about climate and sustainability at this time. So when we launched Bloomberg Green, our goal was really to fill what we saw as a gap in the media landscape for a publication that was truly focused on climate. And not just covering climate as a way of covering the gloom and doom as we often see in climate coverage. And it can be a scary and overwhelming time as the time that we're currently living in is. But there's also so much opportunity to be covered in the climate and sustainability world. There's so much activity going on among businesses, among consumers, among technologists, among activists that are really working to strike this new path forward. There's a need for solutions. There's some great solutions being developed, and we wanted to build a platform that was going to be able to highlight those, really focus not just on what the problem is, but where are the active solutions that are coming into being and that we need to continue to develop. And so for us, being that we're Bloomberg, core to everything we do is data. We've helped people understand the financial markets for decades, and we wanted to bring that same focus to the climate world, to make this something that's very understandable and applicable to business leaders and to investors. So we've put these climate terms in the same language, the same type of charts that we build for the financial world, because we want people to understand that climate is not a trade-off, that thinking about sustainability is not just a money suck for your company. It's actually a way that you can save money, or you can attract new business. It's something that's going to keep you relevant. And when we go through major challenges like what we're seeing right now in the world, sustainability is what is going to keep your company successful. It's what's going to allow you to continue to exist. And it's going to prepare you for this planning. If you've gone through all that scenario analysis, if you've gone through this risk planning, you're better prepared to weather these difficult times. And the current crisis we're going through with COVID and climate change are very analogous in that way. So one of the big things that we built as part of Bloomberg Green was this Bloomberg Green data dashboard. And you're seeing some clips here from what that dashboard looks like. I definitely encourage you all, if you have not previously seen Bloomberg Green, to go to our website, bloomberg.com/green, play around with this dashboard. You'll see these constantly updating statistics. They follow you on every article, things like the real-time power mix, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. You can see how these things have changed over time, these active layering of statistics. And then you get the descriptions and the color from our newsroom below that explain things like, how did we come up with this information? This is not, climate information, as many of you know, is not always the most interpretable. It's comes in on websites and in buckets and in not easy to understand ways. And we want to be part of helping people to understand that. And then also to evaluating the solution. So that's something that's key to everything that we've been doing. We are a multi-platform brand at Bloomberg, so we wanted to tell this story across every platform that we've got. We're doing podcasts, we're doing the Most Sustainable magazine that will be printed, we're doing Twitter, and we're doing live events, and we're doing a scorecard that's going to help people evaluate climate solutions. So this is a big project that we're going to be working on across the years to come. This is something that's going to be a key part of our media business. Now, that's January. So much has changed since then. And I know everybody is really rethinking how you want to be telling your story at this moment, what this experience is going to be like for you. And as we've worked on Bloomberg Green over the past 3 months, we've gained some insights into this based on what our readerships have been focused on, the stories that are really resonating. So I want to share that with you as some insight about what you should be thinking about and talking at this time. These are the top 5 stories that we've seen on Bloomberg Green since launch. By far and away, the most read one has been this one about wind turbine blades, how they can't be recycled, so they're currently ending up in landfills. This is a great example of a solution story where there's a need for a really pressing solution for an issue here. And we're seeing that over and over in our readership. People are really looking for these stories that are helping them identify major challenges in the world and what the solutions are, either that are coming into being or need to be created to fulfill them. In the COVID era, over the past like six weeks or so, we've seen a real uptick in our readership around understanding what this moment means for the climate. So we're seeing these dramatic changes in human behavior, in the ways that we get around, in the ways that we interact with our world. And so our readers are really gearing towards these stories that help them understand what the impact of that is going to be on the climate. And I think that's something I encourage you all to think about as you think about how you want to talk about climate during this time, thinking about what these big changes are, thinking about what the changes in the way your company is operating are and what that has on the climate, what we can learn from this. We're seeing a lot of our readership really gear towards those stories. So stories like what's happening with oil plunges, what it looks like from space when everything stops, when people are not filling the locations that they've been filling before, and things are really changing. This is a really good opportunity for us to really think about what it means to rethink the status quo and what we can do as companies and investors to contribute to that and to use this moment to create a better world on the other side. And so as you're marketing in this time and as you're thinking about how you want to talk about your impacts with climate and with sustainability, we would want to encourage you to think about how you're going to ensure relevance in the marketing that you're doing now and in the future. So as you think about the way that you want to be talking in the market right now, the way that you're interacting with climate and sustainability, 2 questions we're encouraging as a result of everything that we're seeing with our readership and looking at what people want to engage with right now. The first one is, how are you taking actions to provide sustainable solutions now? So if you're thinking about what you want to be talking about in the market, it does need to have something that's really relevant in this moment. Take that opportunity to stand up and say, this is what we're doing in our community. This is what we're doing with our employees. It's a good way for you to bring that moment now. Climate can be such a future story. It's one of the challenges of getting people to engage on this topic is that people struggle to think so far in advance. And this moment has forced us to think about a lot of these things very quickly. We've seen what it looks like when we take collective action in a very short amount of time, when the world dramatically changes the way that we are acting, when we make huge government decisions very quickly. This is a great moment to really think about those long-term challenges, bringing them to this current moment and what it means to take that really quick action. So really think about, as you're marketing, how your company and your organization is really contributing to this challenge now. And then how will you help build a more resilient world in the future? This is not a challenge that's going to go away today or tomorrow. It's something that's going to go long term. And as I said before, really thinking about what it means to be a sustainable company. It means to be prepared for the long term. It means to be thinking about what those challenges are going to be down the road, preparing for them now, thinking about things that are not just outside your front door. So if you're thinking about what feels appropriate to say in the market right now, what should we be putting out in the world in this challenging time? If you think of these 2 questions, how is that relevant now, and how are you building this more resilient world in the future? If you're able to answer those 2 questions with the messaging you're putting out, then it's a good piece to be talking about at this time. It's something that's going to resonate as people are thinking about how this impacts them in the short term and impacts them in the long term as well. That's it for me, and I'll turn it back over to Margaret for the rest of the panel.
Thank you so very much, Lauren. What a fascinating resource for us as marketeers and indeed for the business community. One place, multi-platform, everything climate change, put together in such an intuitive fashion. Thank you very much for sharing that with us today. So Vikram, I'd like to get your reaction to the data and the perspective that Lauren shared just before we have an in-depth discussion with both yourself and Filip. You are leading marketing customer experience for the #1 bank in the UAE, and in fact, one of the top 100 financial services brands globally. So you have a very interesting vantage point. First up, what's your thoughts on what Lauren shared?
I think, Lauren, first of all, thank you very much for the work that you're putting together. I've always believed that, a combination of information, action, and impact, if that comes in together, then that can actually drive social change at scale. And I think some of the work that you're trying to do is hopefully going to help us deliver that, not just in the US, but across the world. And I think one of the stats that really struck me was 2,556 soccer pitches of forests are destroyed per hour. I think that's shocking.
Yeah.
Right? And I think it is super important that all of us reflect on our own intergenerational equity and try to understand the impact that we're making and the world that we're leaving behind.
Okay.
So I think these are my sort of initial thoughts, and of course we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail.
Certainly, I look forward to getting back to that notion of intergenerational equity at scale. Filip, you are leading marketing, brand, and sustainability, very interesting combination, at Ørsted. And if my research serves me correctly, your company has been described or ranked as the most sustainable company in the world. So your perspective is very appreciated. What's your first reaction to what Lauren presented?
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Lauren, for that interesting presentation. Thank you for having me. I think what I brought with me above all is quite simply the need to take action, that people are looking, as Lauren put it, for stories about what the solutions are and what companies are doing to drive those solutions. And I think that's also what we've seen during the COVID-19 crisis, that people want companies also to be a part of bringing forward the solutions. Governments have a lot to do, obviously, but what can companies do also to help? And that's something that we're going to continue to see a lot of, also when it comes to climate change.
Marvelous. So momentarily, I will get back to understanding more deeply your solution orientation and how you've actioned those thoughts. So Vikram, let's have maybe 10 minutes of a conversation with yourself. What strikes me as interesting, many things, but one, you're at a financial institution. So, and we're all marketers. So let's anchor the conversation first in why the emphasis on sustainability at the bank and how that is received by your customers and other constituents as marketeers. That's an important question. We need to prioritize many possibilities in terms of our purpose, our resource allocation, our emphasis. You've put some emphasis on this. Give us perspective on why and how it's being received.
I think it's fascinating to note that in the last 5 to 7 years, a lot of focus has gone behind the different aspects of climate change. And as a result of that, we're beginning to see early signs of capital following that path as well. So in the times where most CMOs are wondering where the budgets are going to come from, this becomes an important question. So, I'm actually, if you just go back a couple of years, I'm fascinated to see the growth in ESG funds, environment, social, and governance related funds. So these are essentially funds that are investing in companies, projects, and assignments that are oriented towards the environment, have a strong social and community orientation, and have a governance mechanism built around it to track that successfully. So that was about $20 billion last year. It grew 4x over 2018. And it's expected that, in the next 3 years, this might be a $100 billion market.
Just to be clear, Vikram, you're suggesting those capital flows went into funds, the 20 billion is funds focused on, okay.
Yes, yeah. And it's not just that, we're also seeing almost $215 billion going into carbon credits. So this is an interesting stat because many organizations are looking at what their carbon footprint is and are seeking ways to offset it. They're doing that because it probably makes commercial sense for them, and the reason is that the customers are seeking that from them, both individual as well as institutionals. Another very interesting stat that I've been following through is the growth in the green bonds market. It is expected that by the end of the year, it'll become a $1 trillion industry. So clearly, what I find interesting from a financial markets perspective is the emergence of a green economy, so to say. And the good news is that it is growing very rapidly. You're looking at double-digit growth. And I don't see any reason why the double-digit growth is not going to continue over the next 5 years. So in a post-COVID world, this is a conversation that we must have as marketeers.
So we must have because it's a moral imperative, or we must have because it's a financial imperative and a wise investment decision, or we must have because our customers are desirous of that perspective?
I think it's a combination of both, but of all three. But I'll particularly talk about customers. So there was an interesting study that JP Morgan did recently, and they came up with a stat that 95% of millennials are looking at climate change related causes that companies are pursuing, and that will influence the products that they buy from them, whether they seek those companies to be potential employment opportunities for them, and perhaps at a later stage, would they invest in those as well? So I think it is no longer a sustainability report that many organizations will have as a part of the annual report. I think more and more this is becoming center stage in organizations, decision making and strategic thinking.
And that certainly seems to be at a more accelerated pace recently. You've referenced the fourth sector from time to time. What does that mean in this context?
So, none of us have a crystal ball in our hand, but I've been trying to think about what are the companies that are likely to succeed going into the future, and how will they be different from the pre-COVID world? So, BC and AD after the disaster, will companies be any different? So one of the things that has really caught my attention is the fourth sector. So if you look at the structural context of our economy, you have the government, you have the social sector, and you have the public sector. And the government is really looking at its citizens. The public sector is more non-profit in nature, or maybe making marginal profits as such. And the social sector is largely non-profit. So I think it's interesting to see the emergence of the fourth sector, which is somewhere in between all three of them. And it exists for the benefit of everybody. So essentially, what a fourth sector enterprise tries to do is to figure out a way to live harmoniously with its staff, with its customers, with the environment, with the shareholders, and the supply chain. We're beginning to see some industries and some companies which are displaying early signs of this. I've been following Patagonia for the last couple of years, and I find that fascinating. I've also been in the world of financial markets. I've been following Grameen Bank. So that's a microcredit financial institution based out of Bangladesh.
Yes.
So there are many such companies that are coming into play, and I just hope that the fourth sector becomes a norm in the decade ahead.
So that's a very interesting macro analysis, Vikram, and a very good framework to keep in mind. Could you give us some thinking on the implications of all of this for our marketing budgets and or our company positioning? It seems that a lot of your discussion is alluding to purpose, and the data that you've shared seems to suggest that our customers, particularly millennials, put purpose at the center of their decision making. What does all this mean for your marketing positioning of your company and also indeed your budget allocations? Has it made any changes?
So we've, at the bank, we've completely changed the way we have been marketing post the COVID, I can't say post-COVID crisis yet, it's still unfolding. But what we are doing now is that any product or any communication that we're putting out there to our customers, we are referencing that to the current situation. So what we have found mathematically is that as soon as you reference to the current situation where you are empathetic about what's going on, and you really try to add tangible value now into the conversation, customers are finding that quite useful. Yes. So I think, going forward, I think purpose would become more and more important, not just for the organization, but also for the larger context of the frameworks that organizations exist in. And that needs to then consistently reflect in the organization's marketing strategy. And the important point is that customers are going to hold us responsible if we do not display an intent and a purpose that is adding value to all.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that insight, Vikram. So now let's go to Denmark. Good morning, good afternoon again, Filip. So before we get into an in-depth discussion, I want to make sure everyone knows what your organization does, and indeed, very practically, what is your business model?
Right. Thanks a lot, Margaret. So we're the leading company globally in building and operating offshore wind. So we do that in Europe, in North America, and in APAC. And that is essentially the big brand of our business today. We used to be, a decade ago, a very fossil fuels intensive energy company. A lot of coal, also oil and gas production. But over a decade, we've transformed from fossil fuels to now green energy. It's been a fascinating journey, of course. And in the process, we reduced our carbon emissions around 90%. And also elevated the share of green energy to almost 100%, close to that. And we're going to get to that within the next year. So that is the company in a nutshell, what we do today and what our journey has been.
So from Ørsted's perspective, this is not merely a marketing artifact. This is fundamental core operating changes at the company level.
It is, certainly. It really is. And our purpose is what we stand for as a company. Our purpose is to help build a world that runs entirely on green energy. And that is also what the business is about. Big
ambitions. And how has your customers and your investors and the community at large responded to that transition or evolution?
Extremely positive. We see positive reactions from all of our key target audiences. And it's been so throughout the whole period of our transformation, if you will, but obviously, especially the last 2-3 years, I think we've really seen how everyone has connected with the ambition that we have as a company and our journey towards a green company. An example, ESG investors that I'll come back to later is one example of a target audience, that a stakeholder group that used to maybe not focus so much on it, but today really focuses a lot. We see it when we do employer branding, when we try to attract top talent to the company, which of course to us, as to everyone else, is critical for our continued success. And they are really looking more and more to joining a company that has a clear profile when it comes to, well, how do we contribute to making the world a better place, essentially. And of course, also while doing that, is a profitable business.
So Vikram touched on ESGs and the notion that marketeers need to be more aware of ESGs. Could you give us a primer? What are ESGs, and do you support his premise? And how do we all get smart on them? And more important, how do we operationalize the intent?
Yes, well, love to speak a bit about that. So I very much agree with Vikram. What we've seen, as I said, the last years is that there's more and more ESG investors coming in. We are a listed company. We also have bonds. So they're looking to that. But more importantly, I think, or just as importantly, you also see what I guess you would call mainstream investors, that they also become more and more interested in ESG and specifically climate change.
So it's not a niche investor community, a marginalized topic. Are you suggesting it's going toward the mainstream?
Oh, for sure. That's what we are seeing. So the ESG community is growing a lot, like Vikram said, but the mainstream investment community is also becoming more and more interested in ESG and notably climate. Just a couple of data points. A lot of the big pension funds, they have now decided not to invest anymore in coal, not at all. And they are looking with more and more scrutiny on their oil and gas investments. And as far as I know, I heard it the other day, so I haven't had time actually to research it myself, but I heard that now there's only one of the big banks, the big US banks left that still have and facilitate investments in coal. All other banks have discontinued their engagement there. Maybe Vikram can qualify that. It was, as I said, something I picked up. But you see more and more of those data points that really just underline how the investment community is really moving and fast speed towards having a clear focus on climate change. And that is a huge catalyst for change, of course. So in many ways, I would say today, the investment community is starting to be ahead of sort of the general and the average consumer push, right? So it used to be that there wasn't much of a movement in the investment community. Now, in many places, they're ahead of consumers and also in many places ahead of governments.
Fascinating, because I know a lot of what we do tends to follow the money. So if the financial flows are heading there, that can be a harbinger for the future. So oil, it's an all-time low price-wise at the moment. Yet, particularly in the US, we're in an election year, and often that means some of the states that are contentious are heavy industry. There are structural plans in place for the COVID sustainability sort of programming in every country, trying to prop up the economy. What's your perspective? I know if you look back, even to the last Great Recession, we saw fairly swiftly reversing to the emissions levels that predated the then recession, and in frankly exceeding them. Do you think we will see that pattern, or have there been meaningful structural changes that will not take the same trajectory?
That's a really good question, Margaret. There certainly has been very meaningful structural changes. The most important change is that today it's cheaper to build and operate wind and solar energy than coal and gas. So that has changed over the last 5, 6, 7 years. So 10 years ago, after the financial crisis, it was still the other way around. But the energy industry has brought down cost of solar and wind, and that's a huge game changer. And one of the reasons also why investors are looking more and more for green energy investments, because it's the economically rational thing to do, which really changes a lot, of course. So that's a big change. I think a second, if you will, structural change is the unfortunate fact that contrary to 10, 12 years ago, we are today seeing climate change in front of our eyes. We also did that 10 years ago, but I think no one can doubt that the intensity of climate-related events is just so much bigger. And sure, right now, I think a lot of people have maybe forgotten or at least don't talk about the fires in Australia, California. But we will unfortunately see new events. That is one thing that's for sure. And they will put climate change right back also on the public agenda. So I think that drives a continued focus on climate, and that's why climate is not going to go away as it in some at least in some ways, did 10 years ago. I think it's going to continue to be high on the agenda and probably be pushed up even higher on the agenda.
Filip, do you notice a meaningful distinction in terms of public opinion, or indeed, perhaps more important, activity across regions? You have an interesting global vantage point. There's a lot of chatter, as always, about the US. What's your anecdotal perspective? And then maybe I can hand to Lauren for more data-rich perspective, but what's your view?
Yeah, most certainly that's a big difference. Well, if you focus on Europe versus the US, I think what's interesting to see that also in the US, people are also becoming more and more concerned with climate change. Europeans have been there for quite some time. I think climate change was the most important concern that Europeans had at least half a year, 1 year ago. Where it stands now remains to be seen. Probably if you did a poll right now, it would probably be public health, but probably with climate change right there in the back. And in 1 year, I would imagine climate change probably being back on top, maybe together with unemployment and economic recession. But in the US, things have changed a lot the last couple of years.
Yeah.
The events that I've just mentioned, for instance, California fires, they have had a huge impact there. Has it changed enough? Probably not quite, but there is also a shift in opinions, and also, as far as I can tell, within the parts of society, American society, that perhaps traditionally has been more reluctant to acknowledge the existence of climate change. Now, whether that's translated onto the political level, that's a different story, and no, it probably hasn't. We'll see what's going to happen going forward.
Yeah, it's going to be a fascinating election year for sure. So I'd like to invite Vikram and Lauren back to the discussion, if you would, please. Vikram, so COVID-19 is happening, climate change, and your work was gaining some momentum. Is it contributing to that momentum, or is COVID-19 a distraction right now vis-a-vis climate change? How are the two intersecting from your vantage point?
I think the discussion is getting accelerated. It's almost getting cacophonic now. And I am extremely hopeful that this discussion then translates into policy actions. It translates into real tangible actions that individuals do as well. So I think it's about time that we realize that we cannot wait for somebody sitting somewhere to make that change. It's for us as individuals to get together in our own little world and do what's required. So recycle, reuse, grow your own food, amongst many things. I think that's what's needed. And I'm hoping that with this current realization that we've probably messed around with our planet way more than we should have, is a reality that will get people to act.
Lauren, from your vantage point, what do you think? It's a fascinating time to launch, of course, Bloomberg Green. Distraction, COVID-19, accelerator, or some combination of the two?
Climate's going to be a story for a long time. And there's going to be experiences like this, major challenges that are going to come up along the way. So I think we constantly need to be thinking about the overlap between the longer climate story, planning for what we're doing for the world, and these smaller experiences. We're going to continue to see more emergencies and disasters, and the overlap between these two things really gives us that urgency to know that we have to take action on it. So I don't think it's a tough experience for our world, but it's also another reminder that we need to be rethinking the way that we are existing and the status quo that we've been talking about. I would love to also shed some light too on what you were talking about with Filip, Margaret, about the different locations and telling the story in Europe versus the US, being based here in New York. I've been working on sustainability at Bloomberg for quite a few years now across the world. And yes, you're totally right. It's a more advanced conversation in Europe than we see that in our readership, that there's very strong readership for Bloomberg Green in Europe compared to other parts of the world. We have global readers, but it's definitely clear that this is an issue that's at everybody's minds in Europe. But I would say to everyone, like, please don't discount this for the rest of the world as well. This is a global issue. It's truly a global issue, and then you should be marketing around this across the whole world. But what you need to do is curate your marketing strategies based on these different locations. You need to remember that what the conversation is in Europe is not the conversation in Asia right now. It's definitely not the conversation in South America. And you need to be meeting these different communities where they are. This is something I've seen firsthand because we've done sustainability events and we've done climate coverage across the world. So you need to understand the local community, understand where they are in their climate experience, and everyone wants to talk about this right now. I mean, we've done work across the world, so I know that this is something that's at the forefront of everybody's minds. But I would encourage you to think of this as a local strategy, not just one global tactic.
Well, that's a very good marketing practice on all topics, to be mindful of what I characterize as the local accenting of any subject matter. So that's just great marketing counsel, Lauren, in general, for all of us, and a really powerful reminder. Vikram, from your vantage point, you talked a lot about capital flows and the investor community's enthusiasm for ESGs and more generally sustainability in companies. But we're also all experiencing an economic recession, and we're hopeful it won't be a depression. Do you anticipate any challenges with that, be it at the bank or more broadly, as people prioritize putting bread on the table, proverbially, as it were?
I think there's a fundamental realization between what one needs and what one wants. And, companies and industries would need to understand, where do they lie? Do they lie in the need cycle, or do they lie in the want cycle? And the ones that are in the want cycle, for example, travel, leisure, hospitality, to a limited extent, clothing, to some extent, entertainment, etc., they would need to brace themselves up for a period of time, hopefully not very extended, where customers and future consumers would be reassessing their choices around them and would be selectively accessing them. And the ones that are in the needs space, they will need to rally around their own capabilities, their supply chains, and make sure that they're able to then get those products and services extended to their customers in a manner which is what they want to. So I think overall, this structural change would affect every company and every marketing organization as well. So even in your own marketing strategy, you'll have to look at what's essential and what's not essential, and make those hard choices and pursue the ones which you think are essential with your full force of capabilities, capital, and creativity.
There's a question coming in from the chat that begins with the premise that we're seeing a reduction in emissions right now. I think that's valid, whether we look at NO, CO, CO2, any of the pollutants. There's also a realization that a lot of that can be attributed to reduced economic activity, reduced commuting, etc. How do we, starting with you, Filip, in a sensitive and appropriate way, message that reduction or wins, climate wins, if you will, to our constituents in an appropriate way that gives it longevity?
Yeah. So I think that while you can perhaps acknowledge, of course, everyone can appreciate that in a very narrow lens and in a very short run, it's good that emissions fall. The state of that society is in, global society is not at the desired state, right? And the point there is that with thriving, if you thrive as a society, as a world community, you have activity, and if you have economic activities in this day and age, you have emissions. So if you want to get back to a normal, it will involve rising emissions, and I think that's important to to state, I think there's a consumer movement that will pick up speed with respect to how individuals, how consumers will think about their choices and also change them. I think transportation has a huge overhaul in store. I think we can already see that, how this will impact, for instance, the aviation industry. But individual choices is not going to do it alone. It's simply not possible. Each and every one of us, we emit perhaps, depending on where you're from, 15, 16, 17 tons of CO2 per year. If you do your very best personally, your very best, you can maybe reduce that with 25%. But then you're already starting to really feel the pain on your personal life. If you want to get to the point where you are sort of have reduced your emissions as much as required, you need to get to 2 tons, from 17 to 2 tons. You cannot do that without that the sort of basic infrastructure changes, how we build buildings, how we produce energy, what cars are available, how you can transport yourself. So that has to change. And so I think that's really important for marketers to acknowledge that it may be, I think it may be tempting to only communicate on behavioral change, but it's not what's going to do the trick long term. And I think people will realize that, and are also realizing that. So I think it's very important that we also change the way that we, for instance, power the world. And for that, you need changes. You simply need to take the existing hardware of carbon emitting hardware and replace it with something green. And that does take some time. So we need to get to it. We need to start doing that.
It's a fascinating conversation in every industry. For example, here in New York, the fashion industry, Lauren and I live at probably the epicenter of the fashion world. And if you look at the impact on that industry on climate change, it's quite dramatic. You can take that analysis to every sector. On one level, it's daunting. The scale and indeed the scope of the change required to drive real impact. On another level, it's inspiring because it's a significant goal. And to the intergenerational equity comment that you made, Vikram, it's a way we can have real impact, but it feels like a tough hill to climb. What do you think, Vikram? I really appreciated your intergenerational equity comment.
Yeah, so I think it's extremely daunting for sure. But what all of us have to do is to think about what is the difference that we can make as individuals. And small little steps that one takes every day are going to make that difference. So, for example, along with my wife, I'm setting up a new venture to protect natural forests all over the world. And we're going to use principles of crowdfunding, get technology into it, and get some really interesting analytics through geospatial imaging. And what we want to do is to tell people who are onto that platform that the forest that you're supporting, how much carbon, how much oxygen, what's the biodiversity that you're supporting, etc. So I'm just giving this as a point because, I believe very strongly that if you feel passionately about a particular topic, don't wait for somebody else to make that change. You ask yourself what you can do and go the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely. I subscribe to that so much. And your passion project is very, very inspiring. I have my own passion project in the fashion area around sustainability. So I definitely empathize and appreciate your passion. Lauren, you touched on a very interesting thought in your opening remarks that struck a chord with me when you essentially said, it's not a trade-off, sustainability and relevance. And you went deeper to assert that, in fact, entities that are mindful of sustainability, that have that risk planning muscle built, essentially are better positioned to weather any storms, be they COVID-19 or others. I thought that was a tremendously powerful insight around the transferability of efforts around climate change to other potential exogenous shocks, if you will. Might you comment a little on that?
Absolutely. I think there's two big things that we're seeing that are going to come out of this COVID experience. They're going to have a big impact in the climate space. The first is to Vikram's point around the growth of ESG. This is a really interesting test for ESG at this time to see what happens. And I think that the social component, which traditionally has been the most difficult to measure, oftentimes is not the one that people are most focused on. You know, governance is very clear, environment takes the lead. I think this is social's moment to shine, that this is a time when people are really going to focus on how companies are interacting with their communities and how they treated their employees. And I think coming out of this, we're going to see a lot more interest in employees, employee engagement, the company-employee relationship as a bigger factor in ESG. So I think that's something that we're going to see a lot of growth in, hopefully some new data around. And it's going to be a bigger component of ESG in the future. We're already starting to see some investors talking more broadly about this and how it's something that they're thinking about right now in this moment, how companies are treating their employees and working with them during this tough time. So I see that as a big change that's going to come out in the financial side. And in the corporate side, I really think, and this is something that we highlight a lot at Bloomberg, that the markets and the financing really help drive the support for sustainability. So if you can make that connection internally, you have so much more support for anything that you're going to be doing in the sustainability realm. And out of the COVID experience, we're seeing a lot of people not traveling, not doing those business meetings in person that they've been doing. We're seeing how companies are rethinking their emissions and looking at where those things are going. I think we're going to see a lot of changes in policies around teleworking, meeting remotely. People are getting a chance to see what it looks like for us to do important business meetings or live events like this virtually instead of in person. I think that's going to create a lot of changes for us as companies think about what their emissions are. There's going to be a lot of savings for them that they're seeing, and those two go hand in hand. So all of those opportunities where you see something that dually is helpful in minimizing your emissions or improving your supply chain, also saving money, it is really a win-win. It's a no-brainer for these companies, and this experience is going to highlight more of those opportunities.
Certainly, my data supports your analysis. At Siegel+Gale, as you may know, we're a brand strategy consultancy, and we have seen a significant uptick in the interest on the part of clients in purpose and articulating a compelling purpose, but real purpose that reflects the company culture and inspires the employees. Secondarily, we are absolutely seeing what Lauren touched on, real authentic desire for employee engagement and recognition that culture, employee culture, and indeed employee behaviors are actually what makes a brand. And as all of us marketeers in this room recognize, brand is now more than words and pictures. It's the experience. It's the sum of all the touch points that a consumer and every constituent has with our organization. And of course, that transcends the marketing department. It's everyone's responsibility. And that realization is accelerating in the context of COVID-19, a recognition that the employee is a tremendously important constituency and that marketers are now collaborating more and more with HR, which is, although adjacent to the green or the climate conversation, it definitely is a very close relative in what we are seeing. So as we get towards the end, if I could ask you a personal question. I'll start with you, Filip. What do you want your climate change legacy to be? It's a big one. Big, bold question. We're the Marketing Society. We do everything through a brave lens. So we ask sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but truly, have you had a chance to give that some thought?
Yes, I have. Actually, for me, I think that the answer is quite straightforward. Hopefully, that I'll be remembered, if you will, as someone who helped drive that purpose for the company. And also, and this is really importantly, the actions the actions that support that purpose, because that is one of the things we're going to be seeing more and more. If I very much agree that purpose is here to stay, it's going to be even bigger. But the change we're going to see is that up until now, perhaps you could have a purpose, a good purpose, and maybe not always walk the talk so much. You're going to need more and more to walk the talk. Where do you put your money, and what products do you deliver? And there's going to be more and more focus on that, and there's going to be more and more focused on whether you are science-based, as it's called. Time does not allow us to elaborate on that now. But are you doing something? Are you reducing your emissions, or are you doing enough? Are you doing what it takes to bring down emissions to the level that's required to stay within 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius? There's going to be much more focus on that. And as marketers, we really need to take notice of that. I hope I'm going to be remembered as someone who helped drive the development of Ørsted, in this case, in that direction.
Vikram, your climate change legacy.
I've got a long list, actually. But I think my hope is that I want to remain a positive voice in this conversation. I want to explore more and more conversations around creating opportunities where people prosper and live a life that they wish to lead. And probably at a deeply personal level, save as many forests as I can from being cut.
Lauren, please.
I hope to help tell and amplify this story, to help educate people and to understand this issue, to not see it as a trade-off, as I said before, but to see it as something that's essential to how they're living their lives and how they're operating business, that this is not something that's just a passion outside of the work that you do, but it's something that should be critical to every facet of your life, including your job and your company.
So the task is daunting, as we touched on earlier, very easy for us to get overwhelmed. Perhaps in one sentence, starting with yourself, Vikram, at this moment where we're having an intersection of COVID-19 and climate change conversation, what gives you most hope? One sentence.
One sentence. Okay. So COVID for me is an acronym. C standing for collaboration and a sense of community. O stands for optimism, which we all need to demonstrate to come out of this situation. V is vitality, which is personal health, well-being, and to the company that we are. I for me stands for innovation and inspiration. And D stands for a desire to change and make a difference. So COVID, that's what it means to me.
Beautiful. Filip, one sentence. What gives you hope?
Green energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. What are we waiting for? We are still living in the belief that this is not the case. It wasn't. For hundreds of years, it hasn't been the case. It is now. What are we waiting for?
Lauren, you get to the final remark. What gives you hope? Because you have access to a lot of data, which could be inspiring or could be intimidating, depending on your vantage point.
It gives me hope that we as a global community can take collective action, that we're seeing that we can make big changes, and that I hope that we take that to the climate sphere as well.
Marvelous. Well, in thanking our three panelists, just a few concluding remarks. I think we heard a very positive conversation this morning, but the conversation is also anchored in reality. We were inspired by the economics, the notion of changing capital flows, and the recognition that where the money flows, often action follows. We also heard about the economics, the changing economics, in fact, of energy production. As marketeers, we learn to appreciate that our consumers, our community, our organizations want us and reward us for focusing on sustainability, communicating a purpose that resonates, and not merely communicating, but acting on that purpose. We are also reminded with very compelling data that relevance, sustainability, climate control, these are not trade-offs. They can be symbiotic relationships, and the company that's prepared vis-a-vis climate control is better positioned to weather any storm. We also learned, perhaps most poignant of all, that each of us can have a personal impact, whether it is in our passion projects to save the forest, whether it is in amplifying the data that's there and the success stories that pervade us, or indeed in our day-to-day jobs, that we can make a tremendous impact. I'm left with one takeaway, and that is, we as members of the Marketing Society, we as professional marketeers, we wield tremendous power in our budgets, in the stories we put in market, in how we prioritize. And with that power comes commensurate responsibility. It is evident today that this is our moment, that we have an opportunity to take our power, leverage our responsibility to truly make a difference, to expand intergenerational equity, and to leave a legacy of power, a legacy of impact to truly change the world. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Vikram. Thank you, Filip. Truly appreciated your insights. And thank you to all the members of the Marketing Society for joining us today. I know our team would like to get your feedback. We value it immensely. And I invite Siobhan now to put the feedback form up. We'll give you a moment to take that. Thank you again. And do please stay tuned to the emails from the colleagues at the Marketing Society for more conversation. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of day.